I'm the patient. I know that I started having migraines during service. I want to get those service connected. I got my diagnosis. I got my time in service. I have no in-service stuff. Tell me what I do, Clay.
Yeah, so I'm going to start this with two things can be true, okay? One, fact. It's a fact. It's not an opinion. You must have the in-service event for direct service connection. Yes, that's fact. Another fact, how many veterans have medical documentation from service to actually build the Nexus? And the answer is not that many, right? Not that many. And so now that leaves us in a boat of your question. What do I do if I fall into that overwhelming majority? I don't have medical evidence. And first, for framework, I think veterans need to understand you're automatically fighting a losing battle, right? You're fighting uphill, which means the burden of evidence gathering is that much more heavier on your shoulders. So you have to realize that first, because that's really going to prompt you for what's next. And to be real with you, Jason, that's really where statements and buddy letters will come into play. And I don't want to say, the statement and buddy letter alone is going to service connect your claim, because there's going to be other aspects of that. However, you need to plug that hole. There's this huge hole of medical evidence missing, which sucks. That's also a fact, right? But now you need to fill that, whether it's a personal statement saying I took over-the-counter medication, maybe you had a spouse, a doc, your corpsman, your medic, whatever that looks like for you. Anyone who can talk about, you can use, super strength, whatever it's called, Tylenol, instant release gels. You took 4 to 6 of them every single day. Whatever that looks like for you, Motrin, ibuprofen, Advil, over-the-counter medication. And the more evidence that you have, the more lay evidence, I should say, the more lay evidence you have saying, hey, this event actually happened, will help you get towards that service connection. Now, I also want to bring this up too, because you have to look at the truths, right? So yes, medical evidence is required. Most veterans don't have medical evidence, so they have to rely on lay evidence. Another truth is the VA claims process, initial claims, is not really geared towards using lay evidence as concrete evidence. That's why I said, I corrected myself and said lay evidence. If there's a totem pole of golden standard evidence, you would have your health assessments up at the top, right? Like your MEPS exam, your final physical, your annual health assessment, then your pre and post deployment health assessments. That's the golden standard. Lay evidence is all the way down here at self-report, which is still considered evidence, but it's lay evidence. And you will really see that come into play, in my opinion. You won't find this in regulation, but you'll really see statements come into play during the Board of Veteran Appeals, which I hate that I even have to say that, because that shouldn't be the case. Is that VSR going to read your statement? Let's just assume that's the case. They're still heavily going to rely on the CMP examiner, and the CMP examiner, who's medical professional, is looking for medical evidence. So you could logically say, well, I don't have any. That's going to come back as less likely as not, which is probably going to be the case. And so looking at another truth, right? Multiple things are true at the same time. If I was submitting a claim without medical evidence or any evidence from service, one, I would do everything I can to plug that hole. I've seen people use fit reps or NCOERs to fill that gap. I've seen personnel reports, DD-214, statements, buddy letters, anything you can fill that hole, do it. But I would also, as an assumption, meaning to continue planning, right? I would also assume that claim is going to be denied, and to write my statements as if I'm writing them to the rater, aka the judge at that point, right? Just so I'm connecting the dots and building that story. That would be my number one advice. But by you plugging that hole, could you be service connected? Absolutely. I see it happen all the time. Could you be denied? Absolutely. I see it happen all the time, right? So I would just plan to go ahead and appeal that. And that is the thorn in every veteran's side, is medical evidence from service. I hope I answered your question, right?
Yeah. No, you did great. And I'm 100% in agreement. I'm going to add a little bit in there and just kind of double down on a couple things you said. one, building the story is absolutely essential. It has to make sense. If you don't have actual medical documentation evidence from your time in service, then your story better be a good one and it better make sense, right? Somebody who can treat something with over-the-counter medication that most people do treat with over-the-counter medication, that's already something that's in your favor and makes sense, right? If just a normal person goes, well, if you had migraine, what would you tell that person to do? You would tell them to go take some Motrin and aspirin and call it a day. Most people don't say, well, oh, you have a migraine, you need to go to the hospital right now. Nobody does that, right? They say, hey, I got some Motrin, you need some? So that's already kind of building on a story that makes sense. If you broke your back and you're saying, yeah, I broke my back in service, oh, I just don't have any medical evidence, I just took some Motrin. Your story's already kind of a little rocky, right? Because chances are, if you broke your back, you have something in your medical file with the fact that you had to be carried somewhere, airlifted, something, right? So your story has to make sense, very important. And what are you going to write that on? You're going to write that yourself, right? You're going to write that on a form, the 4138. So it's 214138. And that's the form. You're going to write your story. And look, I've said this 1,000 times. I know you're sick of it, Clay, but I'm going to say it again. Treat this like it's $1 million or multi-million-dollar deal, because it is. Don't write 4 sentences and call it a day. Be detailed and write it out. I like your point on you're writing it in hopes that you're going to get it service connected at the VA, but you also have the contingency plan of writing it to where the veterans law judge can look at it and make sense. You don't want any questions remaining from your story. You want everything tied in and all makes sense. So walk them through it, right? Explain your circumstances. I'm not going to sit here and write a story for you out of my mouth right now. You can figure that out, right? Make sure that it makes sense. Explain your circumstances. You were getting hands full of Motrin. They never documented anything. You called it a day. You were fearful of whatever. You didn't want to go to the battalion aid station. You never knew that there was actual real medication out there other than Motrin. You figured that was it. Whatever. Write it out and really explain it. Time frames, durations, all of that type of stuff. What you're trying to do here is prove the nexus. This might have been something, I mean, your time in service may have been 30 years ago. Your severity is on your documentation today. Your nexus is on your documentation from back then, which you have none. So you're explaining the documentation, or you're explaining why you don't have any documentation. You can do what we call buddy statements, right? The buddy statement is actually on a different form. You don't use the 4138, you use the 10210 form. So it's 21-10210, whatever. It's a lot of numbers. It's a different form. Utilize that for your buddies. Anybody that served with you can basically vouch for understanding and seeing that you suffered from migraines in this example. Family members, people that, parents, brothers, sisters, cousins, people that knew you before you joined and can say, hey, look, I can vouch that they never had any issues, never knew them to have any problem until that one Christmas when they came back on leave and they sat down with a bottle of Motrin at the table. And I was like, what the heck, right? They can write statements explaining it too. And like you said, Clay, I agree. Does the VA always get it right? No. Should they? Sure. But they don't. That's what the board's for. And this stuff really does come into play there. So with that, I'm in total agreement with what you're saying. I love the story aspect. I love the statements piece. And can you get these things approved and get service connected without any in-service documentation? Absolutely. You just have to work at it, and the story has to make sense. That's my last 2 cents on that.